Hello, everyone. All right, just making sure my recording was working there. Sorry. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be looking at my key philosophical views, in case you're interested. And I'll apologize for my lighting. I know it's not the best, although it's slightly better than it was last video, but it's not important here because my webcam's not exactly important. We're going to be going over some of my answers to the Phil paper surveys. But first things first, I do have a blog, in case you weren't aware, Crusade Against Ignorance, on WordPress. So I'll link it in the description. Go ahead and give that a follow if you are interested in seeing any writing I may occasionally produce. And today we're going to be looking at this post, My Key Philosophical Views, same title as this video. And while that's loading in, so there's a lot of these that I'm not going to cover. So for those of you who don't know, there was the 2009 Phil paper survey, which was basically just that list right there, rather restricted. And then they added some more. So these are all the additional main questions. And then there's like 60 additional ones on all sorts of super specific things. So all of that to say, you can just look up this Phil papers 2020 discussion document to find all of these. So if there's anything that you want me to explain more, or do a video on, or add to my list here of only a very few of them, then yeah, let me know. I'll make some videos or talk about them, or if any of them you want me to research and make videos explaining, I'll do that too. I also thought it might be fun to get some other philosophers on here, on the channel that is, and go through the main questions and kind of get all of their answers and just kind of see what their key philosophical views are since I'm doing mine. So if you have any suggestions for who I should bring onto that, I've already got a few in mind I'll reach out to, but feel free to drop it in the comments, or as well as any topics you'd like for me to expound on, or if you go on this list and think I should add it, then yeah, I'll do that for sure. But let's go ahead and get into it. So the reason I called this post on my video what it is instead of just my answers to the Phil paper surveys, because I'm only doing a few questions. I went over the questions from the survey I took to be kind of more important or more crucial, fundamental to philosophical worldview or whatever. Although again, it's not entirely comprehensive, but it'll serve for these purposes. So yeah, here we go. Let's get started with it. First question, a priori knowledge. Do we have knowledge prior to experience? My answer was that I lean towards no, because I'm kind of an empiricist, but in a qualified sense that I'll get to later. And I say I lean towards no because, as with a lot of these questions, I'm sort of agnostic as far as not sufficiently studied them enough to be able to give confident, full, fleshed out answers. But I have to say that I lean towards no, at least for a priori knowledge about most things. And as I say in the writing here, I would like to flesh this out more, think about it more, read about it, maybe write something about it. But I kind of follow some Quinean and empiricist general principles that make me at least skeptical about a priori knowledge. So for a priori knowledge and analytic synthetic distinction, which we'll get to in a second, I just recommend Quine. I kind of lean towards accepting what he says about these things, but I'm sort of agnostic on it. Well, I'll just do analytic first. So the analytic synthetic distinction, is there a meaningful distinction between analytic and synthetic statements, so statements that are true just in virtue of what they are, like all bachelors being unmarried men, and then those that are not true in virtue of what they are. And as I say, this one's a little bit tricky. It gets technical. I'm no expert on language, but again, with Quine, my hesitant view is to agree with him and deny the distinction. If you want a little bit more extrapolation on that, Quine has his demonstration of the circularity of analyticity, which is interesting. I'd look into that a bit. And now let's go to abstract objects. And so I should also probably say I've kind of actually changed my view on a few things since I wrote this. So on here, I said that I'm undecided and I want to research it. That part's true. I do like a kind of nominalism, I guess, in the sense that it seems more parsimonious to me. And Stephen Yablo does have a really good paper called Go Figure that argues for like an extreme kind of nominalism, a fictionalism about properties. And later there's a question about properties. I'll say a little bit more about that perhaps. But when it comes to abstract objects and entities and properties, I kind of very recently have started to think that I might like a kind of Platonism about at least sets and certain things, and actually in philosophy of science, certain laws, and then like in biology, genotype libraries and such. So I find at least a kind of Platonism rather defensible and attractive, but yeah, that's something I need to look into a little bit more. Epistemic justification, internalism or externalism. Gotta say I lean towards externalism on this one. For any questions about the externalism stuff, I'll recommend Kripke and Putnam. I'm going to recommend Kripke for a lot of things in this. For analytic synthetic a priori stuff as well, Kripke's good. So yeah, I lean towards a kind of externalism about justification. I think there are features of the external world, our environments, and things that play a key role in justifications for our beliefs. And I'm going to be probably doing a video actually on epistemic externalism soon with a friend of mine who specializes in this, so stay tuned for that. External world. I'm a non-skeptical realist about the external world. I don't know the best way to draw this out. It's kind of one of those positions I've not really ever taken, I guess, honestly, seriously enough to go into some deep literature on, you know, debunking external world, like extreme Cartesian skepticism. So yeah, I'm not a skeptic about the external world. I believe it's real, partially because of it makes the most sense about a bunch of facts about the mind and such, but also, you know, just the classic good old Morean shift. And I feel like I have pretty big hands, which I feel like means my Morean shift is stronger than most people's, because I have a pretty big hand, so I can about palm a basketball. So, you know, here's a hand and it's a good size one, here's another. So yeah, non-skeptical realism on that. Free will. Not that I've read a ton on this, but I definitely strongly accept a kind of compatibilism. As I say here, I mean, this is probably a little bit too strong of a claim, but all the alternatives seem kind of wrong to me. Libertarian free will, aside from not fitting with certain things we know about, say, neuroscience or, you know, physics and what have you, it does seem to have kind of explanatory regress problems for me, as far as if it's not, you know, complete indeterminism is no more free than total determinism. And that's not really the regress problem, but that's actually really its own problem. And I don't really see any reason to accept a hard determinism. And as I say, not to mention, seems to me it would sort of do away with concepts of moral responsibility that are meaningful. That's not necessarily a reason to reject it, but it's a reason to not find it attractive. And yeah, I guess I don't see a reason to accept hard determinism. I don't see why, or incompatibilism in general. I don't see any, I've never really felt compelled by the argument that, you know, if my actions are determined, I'm not the key causal factor in bringing them about. So I'm perfectly comfortable with a kind of compatibilism, and I think it squares a lot of the problems. God and religion. If you're familiar with my past videos and interviews, you'll probably know my answer on this one. I believe there are no gods, there are no arguments that should convince anyone there are. Kind of an Oppian approach to arguments with a pretty high standard of success, for at least for arguments for, and not with all arguments, but in particular arguments for theism, always have really complex baggage, almost always, I should say. As far as, you know, any kind of cosmological argument or fine tuning, which I think are the best arguments for theism, you know, they make assumptions or controversial premises that assume certain things about modality, causality, modal causality, as far as fine tuning stuff, God's intentions, and it goes back to that free will question. So I just think all the arguments for theism, at least the good ones, make controversial assumptions, so they shouldn't really be convincing to people, and Oppie makes similar points. But I should say, as far as on the matter, I wanted to add the qualifier about religion here. I don't think being a naturalist or an atheist conflicts with being religious in a broad sense. And as I say here, I kind of myself am drawn to a sort of fictionalist kind of religious paganism, which I should probably update this to say heathenry, because also true is not completely accurate. That it's accurate, but I won't get into that. Knowledge, so empiricism or rationalism. I guess I should say, to qualify, I take something like empiricism to be true. Empiricism in the classic Humean Lockean sense, we've known to be false for a while in the more primitive formulations. Noam Chomsky is I think, pretty knockdown argument against old empiricism. But, you know, there are the kind of empiricism that emerges from, say, Quine's Two Dogmas paper and Bas van Frossen's empirical stance. Seem roughly something right to me. If you want a good introduction to this topic, the YouTuber Kane B, who some of you may be familiar with, has a whole video on empiricism, and he goes through the Chomsky argument against old empiricism, and then he also lays out the Bas van Frossen view, which is kind of this empirical stance, which is not rationalism entirely, but it also doesn't deny innate concepts, which I will come back to in my my answer to concepts here. Laws of nature. This is one I might have also changed in similar vein, I viewing kind of being an almost Platonist about certain laws of nature, perhaps. I am still agnostic on this, I guess. And I don't know what it would mean to say that laws of nature are like their own entities. I don't see how laws could be entities, but I also don't know that that means, not that that's the only realist view on laws of nature. But if they are laws, as far as whether or not they're regularities or not, I guess I lean towards thinking they're not regularities. I mean, yeah, as I say here, this one's tough for me because I like the Humean line a little bit, a qualified version of it, but ultimately at the end of the day, I don't know if I really want to accept that they're mere regularities. I'm agnostic. I wouldn't take them to be like their own separate entities, but as far as descriptions of phenomena, the phenomena they pick out, usually probably a non-regularity view. So I've probably updated my thoughts on that a little bit since writing this. Mental content, definitely an externalist. See Kripke for that again, and also Hilary Putnam, who I again reference his twin Earth thought experiment about H2O and XYZ and water. As far as meta ethics, I'm definitely a moral realist. And then as far as grounding metaethics, I'm not really sure. I guess, as I say, I've historically lent towards a kind of non-naturalism because of Hume's is the fact value distinction, or Hume's is ought gap. So maybe a kind of non-naturalism. I'm also kind of open to a kind of a contractarian grounding, following someone like Scanlon. Metaphilosophy. And this one can get kind of confusing and weird. I guess all these can, it's philosophy. But I'm a metaphilosophical naturalist, and so people will mean different things by that. And I should probably qualify what I say here. I say it's a mistake to do non-empirical philosophy where empirical considerations exist, such as in science, mind, and metaphysics. So for a little bit more expounding on this, I would just say doing a total a priori philosophy in domains where we have scientific findings that may help, I think, is a mistake. So I very much am kind of a Dennettian in the sense of the spirit of how I want to conduct philosophy, like philosophy of mind, of very much so taking into account empirical considerations. And more recently, the James Ladyman, Don Ross, ontostructural realism, the new scientism, naturalized metaphysics, basically scientific metaphysics. I'm kind of a fan of that project. I think where science can be consulted, or at least there's reason to believe that science will have interesting things to say, it would be a mistake to ignore or try to do complete a priori reasoning about something like metaphysics when we have tools, empirical scientific tools to investigate certain phenomena. Same with mind. We know a lot more about the mind now than we did in Descartes' time, and some of that is due to developments in philosophy of mind, but a lot of it's also due to developments in cognitive science and in neuroscience more specifically. I'm definitely not, I don't want to make it sound like I'm a total like eliminativist. I don't think science will have all the answers. I don't subscribe to scientism. And then there's the other sense of the metaphilosophical naturalism, where I do agree with Timothy Williamson that philosophy's methodology is not something extremely separate from the sciences. There's theories, there's ways to test it. The forms of testing are a little bit different. So I guess I'm a metaphilosophical naturalist in both senses. Philosophy doesn't do anything completely different from science, and philosophy should definitely consult science, and vice versa. Mind, I'm comfortable calling myself a kind of physicalist. And I don't really know much what else to say beyond that. Partially because of the ambiguity of the terms, as far as like reductive versus non-reductive physicalist. People mean different things by those words. They can be vague. So on some definitions of reduction, I'd be a non-reductivist. On some, I'd be a reductionist or reductivist. So it's an open question. And I guess I say this twice in this post. I sort of lean towards a kind of functionalism about some mental states. But of course, bare bones functionalism has its own set of problems. But I think any view of the mind is going to have problems, at least for a while. But yeah, I'm a physicalist. Toes to the fire on most definitions, probably a reductive physicalist. But again, I really don't know. Maybe I'm a non-reductionist. I don't know. Normative ethics. This is a good one. I'm definitely, I like virtue ethics. And then there's some virtue ethicists like Philippa Foot, Michael Thompson, who are big on teleological ethics. I've not been big on teleological ethics traditionally, but maybe I should be. So I'm kind of undecided on that. As I say here, I also have ultimately, for the short answer is I'm a virtue ethicist. The more complicated answer is I'm an ethical pluralist. So I think there are multiple factors. And I think this just makes the most sense. I mean, cultivating character, I think, is kind of central, though, to virtue. But I also think consequences are important, so we should not ignore some of the insights of consequentialism. And I also think, as far as dealing, especially with more complex societal normative questions, something like a contractarian approach is definitely worth considering. So, kind of pluralism, ultimately virtue, though. Personal identity, I don't really know on this one. I kind of hope there's some synthesis between what's called the body or biological view and then the psychological or personality view. I guess psychological views in some cases is different than the personality one. I guess I lean towards being a personality theorist. I don't know that but I think my personality is tied to my body in a way, because I think my mind is, just my brain, a certain kind of identity relation there. But I do think being me has something definitely to do with psychological continuity and future and past interests. Proper names, I'm a million for sure. I think most philosophers are. I mean, Kripke in Naming a Necessity, that was one of his big things in that lecture series, was arguing for the million view over Frege, over the Fregean. And yeah, I definitely just agree with standard what Kripke says. And then my friend Graham Seth Moore has a good video on this called Some Thoughts on Theoretical Identification. So check that out. Definitely a million. Political philosophy. Well, as you know, I'm a socialist, but more in the more philosophical jargon, I'm an egalitarian, confidently, as I say. And I think equality is definitely, it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that equality should be form the basis of our political reasoning and the ways we try to structure societies and political systems. Once, of course, equality is properly defined and defended and such, and it's laid out what it actually is. The more particular view is, kind of libertarian socialism, and I'm an anarchist states too. But, I still have those libertarian tendencies from when I was younger, as far as, there are good reasons to be skeptical of the state and for relying, more so relying on community and mutual aid and, self-reliance. But because of my commitment to freedom and equality, again, being anti-capitalist, or at least an egalitarian, more fundamentally an egalitarian than anything. Oh, science, definitely a scientific realist. And there's a kind of, I guess the only non-realist view I'd be open to at this point is what Latham and Ross defend, which is ontic structural realism in physics. Partially because physics is just really, really, really fucking weird. And, there's a lot we don't know, and it's hard to figure out. So the kind of structure rainforest realism view they propose is, maybe it's right. And most people take the OSR to be a non-realist view, and I think it's kind of a linguistic quibble to say that it's non-realist. I mean, it's a very scientific approach. It's just they don't think that some of current physics picks out real entities. But of course, current physics, when you get on a level of quantum mechanics, picks out multiple entities, and there are multiple theories on which one's right. So I think ontic structural realism need not be defined as an anti-realist or non-realist view. I think it could just be the case that the entities that physics ends up picking out, the real entities, will be the ontic structure. And then, I could go into there's obviously a bigger story to tell here about why I'm a scientific realist, but for these intents and purposes, the no miracles argument has always seemed pretty satisfactory to me. I mean, the success of science seems like it'd be a miracle unless science, really progressed and really picked out real entities in the world. I think genes exist and quarks and strings, and strings more theoretical, but you know what I mean. Bosons, fermions, what have you. Trolley problem, man, this one's tough. And this the bare bones Philippa Foot 1-5 case. Even though I'm a virtue ethicist, this is where my pluralism comes out. You just gotta throw the switch, man. Just gotta. And so that's part of the reason I am a pluralist, actually, is cases like this, where I'm like, oh, maybe my character would be affected. But because I'm primarily a virtue ethicist, in the fat man case, I would probably not push the fat man. Although I also don't really think there's a meaningful distinction between killing and letting die, but this all gets complicated. Basic answer is, it's just got to do it. Pull the switch, save the 5 at the expense of the 1. Truth, man, I don't know. As the classic saying goes, we all know what truth is till we try to define it. I'm definitely undecided. I, I guess this is one of those cases where if I'm being honest, when I say I lean towards a view, I'm really just saying I like that view, and I would probably at this point prefer it to be true, but I don't have any really good reason to think so. Just being transparent. I guess I lean towards, it means I like a kind of deflationism. And I guess this is because I don't really know if truth has its own like metaphysical weight. And I do like the deflationist story because once we've picked out why something's true, I don't know if there's any further story to tell there. So yeah, zombies, philosophical zombies, I think they're conceivable, but not metaphysically possible. I think it's pretty easy to conceive of that. Yeah, you know, there's my friend, but it's not actually my friend. It's a copy of him that has no subjective experiences. I feel like I can conceive of that, sure. But I don't think it's metaphysically possible, just because I think a microphysical duplicate of the actual world would be a microphysical duplicate of the world's impliciter. I think, you know, mental facts about experience and subject experience and all that supervene, at least supervene on physical facts. So I don't think you could have a physical copy of me that wasn't, you know, total physical clone of me that wasn't me. I think, yeah. So aims of philosophy, this one I go back and forth on. I think philosophy aims towards truth in some cases, but also that's just unrealistic in some senses. I think some people are a little bit too enamored with this kind of philosophy as pursuing truth view. Yeah, so I really don't know what to say about too much of that. I think, yeah, a mixture of truth, goodness, well-being, generally wisdom too. I think learning how to live together as wise beings. But yeah, I think philosophy's aim should be truth at the end of the day. But I think we should also just be kind of wary and self-aware that that's sort of a lofty goal. Philosophical progress. I think there's a little bit, some domains more than others, as I say, and I think some of the philosophical progress in the areas in which there seems to be a lot of philosophical progress seems to be, as I was saying earlier, the kind of areas of philosophy that can and do consult empirical science. So yeah, I don't know how much progress there really is in something like ethics, because the questions are so normative. It's hard to get past people's moral intuitions, but there is, and I'm generally pretty optimistic about philosophical progress. I think we've made a good amount. So maybe I think there's more than when I wrote this. Philosophical methodology, really at the end of the day, my answer to this one was was twofold. I don't know, and I think they are all good, but as my naturalism probably gives away, I'm a fan of empirical philosophy and language, clearing up linguistic confusions. I think this helps in a lot of areas of philosophy, but I think they all have something else. Eating animals and animal products. This is one I'm pretty interested in myself as a aspiring applied ethicist. So I'm an inconsistent vegetarian in that I'm not an actual vegetarian right now yet. I'm trying to be better. I'm definitely an ethical vegetarian though. I think, so I guess I should qualify. In our current situation, I'm definitely an ethical vegetarian. I think factory farming is clearly evil. There's no defense of it. As far as eating meat simpliciter, I don't think, of course, eating meat's was wrong for some of our ancestors who had to hunt to survive. That's just what animals do, and so I guess I should qualify in that I'm an ethical vegetarian in the sense I'm definitely against factory farming, exploitation, and suffering of animals. In an ideal society where none of that existed, would I be okay with people hunting on occasion and killing and eating animals? Maybe, probably, but I'm definitely comfortable, and I think it's hard to deny that in most cases, especially in society right now, eating animals is wrong. But I don't think using animal products is wrong. Well, first I'll say read Alistair Norcross's argument about eating puppies if you are not an ethical vegetarian. It's one of the most unbeatable arguments I've ever heard in philosophy. I just don't see any way around it. And as for animal products, yeah, my reasoning here was that using animal products like, say, milk or wool, so like shearing sheep, it doesn't hurt them, and actually sometimes in cases it helps them. So there's nothing wrong with using certain things like wool because nothing was harmed in the consumption and production of that. As far as milk, there are problematic practices we do in the extraction of things like milk from cows, genetically breeding them to be swollen and in pain in cases so we get more milk from them. So in some cases, I guess the vegan arguments, I'd be more contextual, but I think as a general statement, it's not true to say that use of animal products like, say, wool and milk and eggs is wrong. I don't think that's wrong. at all. But I would be open to somebody explaining to me why they think I'm wrong on that. This is something I'm not. I definitely know there's a lot to consider. Gender and race. My answers for these might be different, but at this point, but I do lean towards thinking that both social constructions in a sense, and there are psychological elements when it comes to gender, as far as it's things like being trans. It's not at all controversial that basically every medical and scientific institution and psychological believes trans people are legitimate. So I think there are maybe psychological elements to that, but I definitely think gender is a social construct, because gender is just the term in sociology for how society treats masculinity and femininity. So I think gender by definition is a social construct. It's definitely not identifiable with biological sex. That's just a ridiculous view. And race, I would be a little bit more tentative to make a claim about this, but I lean towards thinking it is also a kind of social construction. We're all Homo sapiens, as far as further distinctions of that based on skin color and distribution over continents and such over our evolutionary history. I don't think there's much of a real phenomena to pick out there. Experience machine. Nozick's old thought experiment about just entering a pleasure machine. I would not enter it. Shelley Kagan in his lectures from Yale on death goes over this and talks about, experience machine would kind of be like if you were a rat that could just flip a lever and get this pleasurable experience, and eventually it stops eating and everything and it dies. It's just, the experience machine would be pleasurable, sure, and it would be a fine existence, but it's not the kind of existence that contains the quality of things that I think make being alive worth living. Meaning of, and this leads into my meaning of life question. I definitely think it's subjective. I don't know what it would mean to say that there's one meaning of life. If there was, it would have to be something vague enough to incorporate a lot of different individual choices and lifestyles and such. So I definitely think it's subjective. You got to make your own meaning. So I don't think there's a meaning to life, and there's one thing you got to find, or that there's even like 3 or 4. But I think, there is meaning to be found in life, meaning to maybe different things. But yeah, no, I think in the old quote, the purpose of life, the meaning of life is to give life meaning, something like that, I think is vaguely right. We select our own meanings. But I think there are, of course, commonalities to ideal human flourishing, but that's a separate. Abortion, okay, controversial. Most of you probably know I'm pro-choice at this point. I'm trying to remember if I've updated my view on this or not. I definitely think it's probably permissible in the first trimester, and I definitely think it's permissible in the first, because there's not an entity there being harmed in any meaningful sense. There's not a person, there's not a conscious being. And probably in the second as well. Some of this is empirical in embryology. I go back and forth on third trimester abortions, so I won't say a definitive view here. I will just say that once we get to the point where the fetus can feel pain and has certain cognitive faculties and functioning, prior to that, before it's capable of being harmed, I think abortion is permissible. But once it becomes capable of being harmed, then I think it becomes a lot more complex. But I'll say a couple things about that as far as why one might be in favor of third trimester abortions. For one, there's the bodily autonomy cases I find pretty convincing. And then also there are medical procedures to make sure the fetus doesn't feel pain. But I don't know how convincing that is to me, just because you're still harming an entity and killing at least a somewhat conscious organism. Not somewhat conscious, a somewhat advanced organism. But so my main reason for being iffy on third trimester abortions as opposed to being against them is because of bodily autonomy. But generally speaking, yeah, I'm pro-choice across the board. Capital punishment, I take to be generally impermissible. Although I do go back and forth on this one. I think one of the main reasons I'm against it is just because of the precedent of giving governments that much power over human lives. And obviously there's empirical data to show that it doesn't function as a deterrent very well. And I also think that, honestly, forcing somebody to live 60 years in captivity if they're a murderer maybe actually be worse for them than killing them, because then they just get to not exist. And so as opposed to kind of being trapped and sort of in a state of somewhat suffering for decades, they just get to die. So it partially because I think it's not actually sufficient punishment for some deeds, but I have to say there are cases I see where my initial gut reaction is that the perpetrator should be killed, but I generally take it to be impermissible, and there may be special cases. Environmental ethics. This is one I think is straightforward. I would be interesting to see if there were any philosophers that, serious philosophers that entered anthropocentric on this. So the debate here is between, the human-centered, should our environmental ethics, should we be primarily concerned with humans at the expense of other species, or should we just be concerned about the environment and the species and ecosystems in general, the non-anthropocentric view? I definitely take that. I think, the anthropocentric view tends to just completely almost disregard other animal species as not even morally relevant to the discussion. And I think that's one of the most straightforwardly ridiculous and immoral things and wrong things that I've heard. So as far as items on this list, I think the anthropocentric view on environmental ethics is probably what I take to be the least defensible. I'm fine with most other things, having a conversation about that. Causation, I don't know about this one. I lean towards just being primitive. And as I say here, it'd be fun to defend a view that causation doesn't exist. I think that's a pretty absurd view, but it'd be fun to try to defend it. I would have a blast doing that. So maybe if I was I'm not a metaphysics person, I'm more ethics and science, but if I were to dabble in metaphysics, it would just be to defend crazy shit like this for fun. But as far as my actual view, I have no idea. I lean towards just saying causation is primitive. I think any of the other views are sort of get complicated and commit you to controversial things about time and what have you. Concepts. This one's interesting. So broadly speaking, there's two camps here. There's empiricists and nativists about concepts. And you, sorry, you may think from my views so far that I'm an empiricist about concepts, but I actually lean towards a kind of nativism. Empiricists say that there are very few, if any, innate concepts, and most of our how to put it, most of our like cognitive capacities are acquired via some like general purpose mechanisms. Whereas nativists say, I wrote down some notes on it here, that that there are many innate concepts actually, and that the mind is kind of innately ordered into this differentiation of certain domains and subsystems of processing. So even though as I said, I'm a kind of empiricist that doesn't disbelieve in innate knowledge. So I think kind of following the general Chomskyan line, I think at least a kind of moderate nativism makes the most sense about the speed at which humans acquire the ability to structure, say, syntax and semantics and grammar and such. The universal grammar views fallen out of favor, but I think nativism does make some of the most, at least the most evolutionary sense. We'd think evolution would select for organisms that had the proper built-in structures. And if we were all blank slates, I don't know that evolution of higher order animals and primates would have actually ever worked. Consciousness, this is asking about the exact view. Yeah, I'm open to a host of things here. I lean towards some sort of functionalism, but ultimately the kind of view I have on perception and things is a kind of a non-realism about qualia, like a representationalism, but that's a broader conversation. I lean towards some sort of functionalism / theory about something adjacent to the identity theory, but not Armstrong's, something a little more sophisticated. Is there a hard problem of consciousness? I don't really think there is one. As I said, I don't really believe in qualia in the sense that most people mean it. I mean, if people legitimately just mean something like subjective experience by that, it's fairly uncontroversial. And I should probably qualify what I say here. I don't think this is true anymore, at least not necessarily. I think science is going to play a key role. And I guess I should qualify what I mean. I don't completely disbelieve this, but I don't think science is going to be able to tell us everything about consciousness. We're obviously going to have to do a good bit of philosophy of mind as well. But I do think when it comes to consciousness, it is going to be something produced by evolution. And I guess I take a gradualist view on it. I think the bits and pieces of consciousness, kind of like the eye, and I guess this is part of the answer of my clarifying my statement here and answering the hard problem question. When you look at something like the eye, it's hard to explain, but just like looking at a building, if you understand it as being built brick by brick as far and not popping into existence, it's not as hard to explain. So we don't think the eye is that hard to explain anymore because we have Darwinism. And so I think something, and I obviously consciousness is a sharp property. There's not like middling cases of partially conscious, but I think the development of, kind of what would it be? Like carbon-based computers, which would be our brains producing or becoming conscious, to use that language, it's going to fit somewhere in an evolutionary story. And I would still recommend Dennett's work on this as far as getting the broad, big picture of this idea down, at least initially. So he has a chapter 7 of his book, Consciousness Explained, is the evolution of consciousness, which is my favorite chapter in the book. And then his book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, is kind of about the evolution of minds. In its entirety. So yeah, Dennett's good for the big picture stuff, and then read some more sophisticated physicalists on the particulars. But so I don't know that it's actually true to say that we'll have a complete scientific story to tell about consciousness, but I think it might be true that we do, as I say here, have a scientific story to tell about the evolutionary processes that produce consciousness, or at least get close. Epistemic justification, not as super familiar, but I'm not usually a fan of foundationalism, since Sellers, at least, Myth of the Given. Immortality, I would not choose immortality at all. And I guess my reason is partially different now. But Martin Haglund's book is good if you want to engage your continental side, but also do it via a writer that actually makes sense. So engage your continental side, like some continental philosophy ideas, but actually written in a way you can understand them, unlike most other continental philosophy. Martin Haglund's book, This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom, is really interesting for why finite life is the only, understanding ourselves as finite is the only way to make any proper sense of meaning. So, and also Shelley Kagan talks about this in his death lectures, and there's a larger literature on philosophy of death. But yeah, aside from immortalities being boring, I think it would eventually, rule out all meaning. I mean, just try to think about any activity you love doing and doing that for 1 trillion years, and then you still have an infinity of existing to go. I mean, there's nothing I love so much that I could do it for 1 trillion years and want to do it for an infinity more. That's a kind of simplistic answer, but yeah, I would definitely not choose to be immortal. I think it's a very good thing that we die. I would take a few more decades of life in good condition if I were offered it, sure, but I would never want to be immortal. I'm very glad that I'm going to die. Don't take that out of context. This is a kind of random one in here. David Hume, was he a naturalizer or a skeptic? I think he's a naturalizer. And in my opinion, he's the father of naturalism in philosophy, at least when you understand it. I mean, as Dennett says about Hume, it seems like he saw the mechanistic world emerging from Newtonian mechanics and science, and and Hume kind of, you can read in his inquiry and in the treatise, he sort of tries to use empirical methodology and tries to explain things like the mind in mechanistic terms, which is kind of the precursor to naturalism. Material compositions, now we're getting into some metaphysical questions. I lean towards restrictivism. So as far as explaining this, what this question is, when there's groups of material objects, what do they compose? So there's a few views. So when you put material objects together, there's the nihilism view, which is that groups of material objects never compose a further object. They're always just, the material objects that are there originally, they never compose something further. Then there's material universalism, which says that any collection or grouping of physical objects always entails, or it's always, sorry, I don't know how to explain it the best. Universalism basically just says any collection of material objects composes some further object. That's the way to explain it. And then restrictivism, the view I lean towards, says that sometimes material objects compose a further object and sometimes they don't. So I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples for that, so I don't have to go through it. Interlevel metaphysics. Ooh, I forget the exact question. It was kind of just about which concepts in metaphysics are most important at the interlevel. So not like meta-ontology or meta-metaphysics and such, but the interlevel. And I have to say, I'm not that interested in metaphysics. I'm not familiar with it, but I tend to think grounding relations are pretty fundamental, grounding and fundamentality, and then identity. Identity is important for explanation, I think. Possible worlds. Abstract and or non-existent. I don't know if that's right, actually. I don't know if that's actually the correct way to, I guess my view is sort of broadly Aristotelian. I think, as as Aristotle, the Aristotelian view says that, any worlds that are possible share some causal history with the actual one. So there's no possible worlds that are, there's no way reality could have gone that wasn't in some way produced by the initial state of reality as we know it. So I don't know, I guess maybe that means non-existent. I think possible worlds are just a way of talking about possibility in that sense. I'm not sure if I subscribe to something like actually a many worlds theory. But the Aristotelian view is, so it's compatible with being kind of abstract, non-existent, or at least interesting ways of talking. But yeah, so I'm not, I guess the important point is I'm Aristotelian and not anything like a Lewisian modal realist. And I might have changed, as I said, properties, as with abstract entities, I kind of lean towards nominalism or trope theory. And I don't really know what I think about this one anymore. As I said, I'm kind of in favor of a kind of Platonism about some things, or at least I like it. But Stephen Yablo's paper, Go Figure, is really good. And Graham Oppy and I emailed about this a little bit too, where, what are we saying when we say the chair has 4 legs? And then I say, well, the chair is the property of 4-leggedness. What additional information am I giving you? Well, none. So maybe we should just do away with properties. There's no such thing as the property of 4-leggedness. It was just the chair that has 4 legs. So I'm still drawn to that. And for a kind of an extensive defense of that, yeah, Yablo's paper is like 30 pages long, the Go Figure. So yeah, I'd check that out. Temporal ontology. I'm not an expert. I really am not that interested in philosophy of time, nor am I an expert in it. But from what I understand, I'm an eternalist. The scientific reasons would be it's supported by relativity, special and general. It seems to be more so supported. But also it makes better sense of causal persistence sometimes, things like ship of Theseus issues and such. True contradictions. Can there be true contradictions? I'm going to say no. So when it comes to like the liar paradox and things, I don't think P and not P can be true. I think that would just sort of collapse way too much of how I think about things. So I'd rather that not be true, and I don't think there's any good reason to think it is. I should qualify that. There are interesting motivations to accept dialetheism about like the liar paradox, but yeah, I definitely don't think true contradictions are possible, which I guess would entail that I think classical logic is proper as opposed to non-classical propositions. Really no idea on this one. When I did a discussion with Graham Seth Moore and Josh Rasmussen, Graham defended a view on which they don't exist. I guess I'm sympathetic to that, in the sense that propositions aren't really anything over and above sentences or whatever. Principles of sufficient reason. I should probably, yeah, the strong versions, I guess my answer here is pretty classical. It's just the strong versions are probably false because they entail modal collapse, and I'd venture to say most versions are definitely false. And then this is kind of Graham Oppy's line, which is to say the versions that don't entail modal collapse or aren't bad, the weaker versions don't seem very helpful, and as Oppy puts, they don't have much metaphysical bite, and there are some reasons to think some of the weaker versions entail the stronger ones. So I should probably not say anything too confident about this issue, because there are good reasons to accept certain variations of the principle of sufficient reason, but I just think it's hard to escape rootness, and that's just how it seems to me. But yeah, does ought imply can? Yeah, I mean, I don't see how it wouldn't, right? Like if I tell you you ought to, yeah, here we go. Like the example I use, you ought single-handedly stop global warming. Does that really make sense? Like, is it really the case that you ought do that? I mean, if you were omnipotent, if you had the power to snap your fingers and do that, then it would make sense for that statement would make sense. But as it stands, for me to like just grab you on the street and say you ought to, you have some sort of normative obligation to single-handedly stop this giant phenomena, doesn't really make too much sense to me. But I guess to answer this question about politics, yeah, socialism, which I think follows from, and I should say this, I'm first and foremost an egalitarian. If proper egalitarianism did not entail socialism or didn't support it, I'd be an egalitarian over socialist. But I think egalitarianism or socialism follows from proper egalitarian principles. And I also have a high regard for democracy and general welfare. And so I know not everybody's a fan of democracy. I'll do some content defending that later. But yeah, socialist. But the most fundamental elements of my political philosophy are equality and democracy. Other minds. So what species, if any, have other minds? I definitely think most hominids have/had minds, depending on how we understand minds. I definitely think most animals are conscious. But yeah, definitely most vertebrates, and then cephalopods. I mean, it's hard to deny that octopi are conscious, and even maybe even perhaps certain species of squid. Um, yeah, so yeah, as far as consciousness, as far as something, if we're going to go on the minimal definition of they have an experience of what it's like to be that thing, I think almost any living organism is going to have that. But as far as minds in this higher order sense, we think about minds, primates, higher order mammals like whales, and probably advanced cephalopods like octopi, and then maybe even some, and probably birds like crows and ravens, at least some of the more intelligent ones, and then yeah, probably what am I forgetting here? Maybe even some rodents like rats, and yeah, so yeah, primates, um, mammals, a lot of higher order mammals, most higher order vertebrates, and some reptiles maybe too. Well-being, what is the proper kind of human well-being? Probably a mixture of virtue and satisfaction of desires. So that splash of hedonism, I guess, is the desire satisfaction part. And I say refined or non-refined hedonism. Yeah, I think the proper kind of human well-being's got to have some, got to account somewhere for days where you can just cut loose and have fun and enjoy carnal pleasures. Eat, drink, be merry. But I don't think that's the end all be all of human well-being. So yeah, virtue first and foremost, probably, but also yeah, making sure you satisfy desires and just have fun and enjoy life sometimes. And these last few questions I added just today. So units of natural selection and philosophy of biology, I gotta say, and this is the main, pretty much the mostly orthodox view amongst biologists at this point, is that the units of natural selection are gene pools or organisms, not individual genes in like the Dawkins selfish gene sense. Very few people believe that selfish genes are the units of natural selection. So yeah, gene pools, organisms. Newcomb's problem, I'm a two-boxer because the omniscient being has already made their decision by the time I take the boxes, so it doesn't matter. Extended mind, I'm kind of unfamiliar with this actually. I recently remembered what it was. I've heard the idea before, but as far as the label for it, I'm undecided, but I'm sympathetic to the idea because, as you've known from my other answers, I'm definitely a card-carrying externalist. So that makes me sympathetic to the idea that the mind extends beyond just the confines of our brain. But that would maybe be in conflict with a kind of identity theory. So I don't really know about that one. Political method. I go back and forth on this, but I generally am a fan of a qualified ideal theory. I think we need to use normative concepts and ideas and to aim for the ideal societies. I'm a proper Rawlsian in that sense, but I understand the conservative pessimism about abstract reasoning. So I think we should also take into account what works and what doesn't. But first and foremost, ideal theory. And then I lean towards normative concepts. Which is the most fundamental? Is it fit, reason, value, oughtness? I guess value, as far as that just seems to me to be what normativity means, but there's probably a bigger conversation to be had there that I'm not. And then last but not least, how much philosophical knowledge is there? Is there a little? Is there none? Is there like a buttload of it? This sounds almost like an empirical question to me. I'd probably just say a little. There's a little bit of philosophical knowledge. We made some progress since Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, but I don't think there's like this wealth of knowledge, but I'd have to look at that question a little bit more. So, wow. All right. That's all the ones I answered. So hopefully that gives you an idea, basically, of my philosophical worldview, at least the basics of it. And sorry for the bad lighting. Again, I know I'm in a weird situation as far as where I'm living right now and then internet and things. So bear with me through some of these weird technicality videos. But yeah, so if you made it this far, wow. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you have a general idea of my worldview. Again, if you have questions or would like clarification on any of these things, or videos explaining anything, or there's other questions from the survey you think I should go over or explain, yeah, let me know. I'll do my best to do that. Check out the blog as I showed earlier, like and subscribe to the channel, and check out our Patreon my Patreon. I don't know who am I referring to, if you'd be interested in supporting the channel in that sense. But just having you watch the videos and subscribe and like and comment is support enough. So thank you, and have a good one.